Hello, I'm Jim Leaviss from M&G, and I'm here today with Paul Tucker, who's a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and also was Deputy Governor of the Bank of England and a regulator in the UK for over 30 years. Here today to discuss with him his new book, Unelected Power, I think a very important book about the power of central banks and whether they're accountable enough. Paul, I'm going to start by reading you a quote from the book from Chicago's Henry Simons from the 1930s. Delegation to administrative authorities with substantial discretionary power must be invoked sparingly if democratic institutions are to be preserved, and it's utterly inappropriate in the money field. Do you agree with that?
It's a great quote, because what it does, in part, is it punctures the view of people that think that independent central banks are a neoliberal plot. There's one of the high priests of neoliberalism saying, be careful of independent central banks. I think he's right and he's wrong. He's wrong in that we no longer live in a world where the gold standard could work. Volatility in jobs and economic activity would be too great. So you have to delegate it to something like an independent central bank. He's right in that you have to do that really carefully. You have to set them a clear objective that they can be monitored against, and it took far too long for the world to gravitate to a solution to that problem.
Isn't there an argument, Paul, that central bankers are, as you describe in the book, natural experts, and we should regard them in the same way as we'd think of a doctor or an air traffic controller and leave the difficult stuff to them?
But unlike individual doctors, central bankers take decisions that affect every single person and business in the country. And they are natural experts about the very core of the banking system and the money markets and the payment system. But for decades, they advised politicians and politicians decided. The problem with that is that the politicians are always running for re-election, and so they'll always tilt in the direction of a bit too much growth to be popular with the people today. And so the Western world has moved towards independent central banks, but then how to constrain them, how to avoid giving them power that doesn't belong in unelected hands. That's the theme of the book.
If we think back, though, to why central banks are independent in the first place and why this great wave of independence happened over the past 30 years, aren't the benefits that we've had in terms of lower borrowing costs and a lower inflation risk premium, aren't they worth it for a possible lack of accountability on the other side of the equation?
So, two or three things there. I think central banks kind of rescued the world from disappearing into the terrible vortex, repeating the problems of the 1930s Great Depression. That was action that we, as I was part of took in 2009 onwards. That's true. But central banks were also amongst other regulators that allowed this crisis to develop in the first place. So they don't walk away, we don't walk away cheering about our achievements. But the final point you make is massive. I mean, the cost of politicians effectively cheating on promises to keep inflation low is that interest rates end up being higher. Everybody ends up paying more for credit than they would otherwise in a world that's inherently has high and unstable inflation. And that's a real benefit. And, parties of the left can use the resources that yields in bigger spending projects. Parties of the right can use that to give tax cuts to their constituents. But either way, it's kind of everybody can win, and the politicians are making distributional choices.
Can't one argue, though, that we already have the checks and balances in place for central banks? For instance, they sit in front of the Treasury Select Committee, they write inflation reports, they can be sacked by the government.
I'm not sure they could, actually.
No,
I'm not sure
OK, well, that one's up in the air.
They couldn't in America. The president couldn't get up in the morning and sack the governors of the Federal Reserve. They have job security. They don't have lifetime tenure in the way that the Supreme Court justices do in the United States, but they have job security until the end of their term, and that kind of protects them from political interference.
But they are like Bank of England MPC members. They sit in front of politicians at regular intervals and are grilled. Is that enough?
It's not quite enough, but it's almost the most important thing. When I was writing this book, I talked to former and current central bankers all around the world. And one of the most interesting conversations was with former Bundesbank presidents. And I said, did you testify to the Bundestag? And the answer was, no, we didn't, and nor should we, because that would undermine our independence. And the attitude in the UK, in London, would be completely different. The attitude of Eddie George and Mervyn King and myself would have been testifying underpins our independence, doesn't undermine it. It's that ability to go and be tested and explain your decisions and allowing Parliament to decide whether to sustain the independence, because it's their choice.
So what more needs to be done? I mean, you describe in the book these overmighty citizens, these central banks. What would be your key points that you think we need to do in order to prevent them becoming ever more mighty?
First of all, I think it's a real danger that they do become overmighty citizens. It's mightily tempting for fiscal authorities to step back and let central banks reinvent themselves as the US cavalry in modern garb. What needs to be done is not expecting them to do more than they can do. It's coming into fashion that they can manage the credit cycle and avoid housing booms and avoid asset price booms. And I'm not sure that's true, and I'm absolutely certain that we don't know how to monitor whether they're doing it well. But what we could say to them and should say to them is make sure that the core of the banking system is completely resilient, that we don't have anything like 2007, 8, 9 for a very, very, very long time.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you, Jim.
Paul's book, Unelected Power, is out now.